Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting schillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. The Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast welcomes Lieutenant Colonel Robert L. Maginnis, U.S. Army retired, a national security and military strategy advisor, certified in Generative Artificial Intelligence from MIT, author of the new book, AI for Mankind's Future, A Christian Perspective on the High-Tech Revolution. Bob Maginnis, welcome back to the Schilling Show Unleashed.
Rob, it's always my pleasure.
We should talk about what AI is at its core, because a lot of people have different ideas or different perspectives. What are we talking about?
Yeah, no doubt. Artificial intelligence really, Rob, is a computer system that learns patterns from large databases. And those patterns it uses to make predictions. It does not think like a human. It does not understand our feelings, our purpose, or our meanings. Simply, it's a pattern recognition and prediction machine. Now, having said that, I recognize that different age people, look at it quite differently. Young people, unfortunately, in some cases, are using it as a operating system for life. Now, that's dangerous, I would argue. For the rest of us, perhaps more older, more accustomed to using CPU, simple, computers, we see it as a tool. Well, it's kind of a blend. And unfortunately, I think a lot is being distorted. And so I really wrote AI for Mankind's Future to answer the question, what is AI? But I will tell you, Rob, at this point, two other parts of this trilogy are going to come out next year. One is going to answer who controls AI, which is very interesting. And the final one coming out next summer is where does AI lead? And that is, of course, a major question for most people, but I think I have some insights.
Bob, it's interesting when we think about who controls AI, but in reality, is not AI beginning to control us?
No, that's a fair question as well. AI learns by looking at millions, thousands of, say, photos or articles, or it scans medical records and then is able to very accurately, in most cases, predict outcomes. Problem is, it does not understand, it can't reason, though it can predict, like a chatbot, can answer your questions most of the time very, very effectively. It can, obviously read a cancer on a CAT scan because it's seen thousands, if not millions, of former CAT scans. It's good at, obviously, anything with massive databases. It's structured, it's repeatable, data-rich stuff is something that it focuses on. And it matters because it's inundating our workplace, our medical world, our transportation, our government, national security, and just everyday life. And so it's something we can't ignore, but we've got to get our hands on it. And it also presents some very serious theological challenges. So going forward, I would hope that people recognize that it's not a new brain. It's not a brain that I necessarily tap into, but it is a prediction machine that can't be ignored.
A lot of people think, Bob, that AI just popped out of nowhere. Would you give us a brief history? This isn't brand new.
No, it's not. And arguably, you can go back many decades to Dartmouth, and where there was really the first idea of artificial intelligence started to be generated. But, mankind has always tried to create something like this, and it wasn't until a few decades ago that it really began to come to fruition. Now, historically, I go through in my book kind of a background on computer science, but then also the background, the history of artificial intelligence. Some people could argue that artificial intelligence goes back to Genesis 11 and the Tower of Babel, and how mankind has tried to reach to God and to replace God. Well, arguably, this technology, though today it's relatively primitive, eventually, we're going to transition through generative AI, agentic AI, maybe artificial general intelligence, which is as smart as any human being, or to something we call singularity, which really, AI thinks on its own, goes into a place where autonomy is not something that we can control, and it begins to take over. Don't know if we're ever going to reach that, but we're spending billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars trying to reach that. And it's not just the United States. The Chinese are doing much the same, and other countries around the world. So this is something that is going to define in many ways our future, and something that we can't ignore.
One of the things that you talk about towards the beginning of the book are some possible harms. I'd like to spend a little time talking about them. Number one is spiritual deception, and certainly we've seen AI pretending to be God or speaking for God on multiple reports.
No doubt. It's being used as to create avatars and to deliver sermons even in Christian churches around the world. But I would argue, as I do in the 17th chapter, AI, Satan's end-time strategic weapon, that it could easily replicate what we see in Revelation 13, 16 to 18. In other words, the mark of the beast. It's already here. If you look at what kind of the social scoring that the Chinese do. What do? They collect data from cameras and monitoring emails and traffic on the internet. They combine all of the data on every individual, and then that gives them a social score as to how dependable this person is in supporting the Communist Chinese Party in China. And as a result, you're allowed to buy and sell and do certain things. If you don't comply with their scoring, then you're not going to get access to those things that you need just for day-to-day life. Now, that's only a reflection of what I think that AI brings to the plate for authoritarian governments. But even in democratic governments, we are being labeled every day by what we interface with on the internet, by our phone calls, by all the data we generate. There are millions of cameras even in the United States that recognize us when we're at the airport. They know your face, TSA does. They know your travel patterns. They know your spending patterns. They know your words because they can monitor your voice, and they have voice imprints. They have facial imprints and so forth. In a democratic society, hopefully it's constrained. There are guidelines. However, in an authoritarian world in which China is promoting across the world using its Belt and Road Initiative, it becomes something that's rather bizarre. Kind of the 1984 sort of view that many of us grew up understanding is what we want to avoid.
There was a story this morning, but it's not just this morning, over the past several months, that President Trump was going all in on AI for various aspects of international competition, which I understand. I don't think you can really ignore that. But how do you prevent the sort of abuse that you just referenced? I mean, it may start in very good terms and with a good ambition, but if the wrong people get in charge in the United States of America, this all goes the wrong way.
I understand why President Trump is doing this. To a certain degree, we're behind the Chinese in a couple of areas, and it's something that we must understand. The Chinese are focused more on generative AI, some agentic AI, and of course that's transforming the battlefields of Ukraine, Middle East, and it will transform our own battlefields as we transition to pilotless aircraft. The same thing for at-sea weapon systems and so forth. But the Chinese, what they are doing, of course, is promoting their own authoritarian agenda, and many nations, Ecuador, certainly people throughout the Middle East, Oceania, are embracing this technology for their own purpose. They are not spending nearly as much as I think our Googles, our Microsofts, our ChatGPT, OpenAI people are spending on these particular issues. But it's very, very decisive as we go forward because more people are turning to AI for answers. AI, once again, only mimics intelligence. It simulates emotions and it predicts outcomes. But yet, more and more of us are turning to AI because it's so quick. It's instantaneous at giving absolutely phenomenally accurate answers most of the time. If you deal with AI as I do every day, you recognize it does make mistakes. And it will never acknowledge it unless you call it out. And so I'm constantly calling it out on mistakes it's made, and it will acknowledge, yeah, that's a mistake, Bob. We need to turn around and do it again. And I insist upon that. But the longer we rely upon it, it learns more and more, and it becomes very, very good at predicting the outcomes that we are seeking or that are really going to help us in doing other things in life. So it is such a mixed bag, but something we cannot ignore.
We should talk about the mistakes. I did a little experiment and asked AI, a couple of the AI engines, about some specific details in my own life, my musical career, which goes back a long time. And while they generally had some good information, there were a couple things that were completely made up and not even close to being true. So the question is it just a mistake, or are there deceptions that are intentional?
Hallucinations. Yes, it does. It does hallucinate, and it hallucinates all the time. But once again, the difficulty I've learned is that initially when I was using it on a daily basis, I came to recognize that it did make mistakes, or it created confidently answers or quotations that just were not pulled out of thin air.
Yes.
Now, we've got to recognize that at the same time, if the database, the large language model in which a generative AI is built around, if that is full of bias, and many of them are, frankly, the initial ones were just collected from the internet, millions of books, millions of articles, millions of photos, and so forth, and there wasn't really any curating of the information that was in that database. And as a result, AI only knows what it knows. It has this massive database, and it's taking my words, turning them into zeros and ones, going through an algorithm, a recipe, a formula, and then pulling out stuff, and in it's finding predictions, and it's saying, look, here's what I say is the right response to your question. So it goes through this process. It does answer our question. It always answers confidently. But if we're not careful, it's drawn from biased information about ourselves, as you indicate, Rob, and it really only knows what's in that database. So if we don't correct it, it's going to continue down that primrose path and lead us in the wrong direction.
Yeah, so I had another experience, Bob, where I asked for some information and it presented a very biased point of view. It was politically related. And then I asked it again to please present the same, answer the same question, but do it without bias. And it came back with a totally different answer. So how is that happening, and who's putting the bias in? Because clearly the default answer was biased.
If you ask the OpenAI people, the Google people that built some of these LLMs, they say, well, we brought our ethicists in here, we brought our engineers in here, and we curated this data. And yes, it is a reflection of what we wanted that particular LLM to look like. Now, I have a friend that is building an LLM for biblical exegesis, and he, is doing this because, the current LLMs have a bias towards certain translations of the Bible, certain commentaries, certain interpretations of the original Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek. I don't want that bias in there. I want it to be sourced from the original text. So if you build a inventory of data that is only original text, and you instrument it through an algorithm that sorts it out the way you want, then you're going to get a very different outcome than if you go into a general purpose LLM and you ask it questions. It's going to come back with what it has. It's not going to create stuff because it can't. It only uses what's in that LLM. And so that's important for people to realize. And there are more specialized LLMs forthcoming. They are very expensive to build, millions and millions of dollars. But I think in time we'll find these curated future LLMs more dependable.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues in a moment with our guest, Robert L. Maginnis.
Schilling Show Unleashed.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
ShillingShowMedia.com will take your project from conception to completion.
ShillingShowMedia.com is reasonably priced and highly professional.
Need a website for your business? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Need a video created or edited? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Have a photography or graphic design project? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
Visit ShillingShowMedia.com. That's ShillingShowMedia.com.
Schilling Show Unleashed.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Robert L. Maginnis, Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army, retired, is our guest. The new book is AI for Mankind's Future, a Christian perspective on the high-tech revolution. I'd love to go to some of the social aspects of this, and particularly in family life. How is it affecting the relationships within families?
It's clearly, if your child is at all introverted, this is going to be a life partner that they embrace, and it's going to become their social operating system, and they will ask it questions that they won't even ask their parents. And unfortunately, as we've come to realize, and there's a fair amount of litigation out there, that some kids are asking very, very dangerous questions that they ought to refer to their parents, and as a result, we've had some very, very bad outcomes for young children. However, it can also be a phenomenal educational tool. It can curate for that child exactly the approach to teaching them how to read, write, do whatever in a way that only the best of professional educators could only dream. And it can do this quickly, and it can be a great partner. But once again, it needs to be controlled, recognizing that it does make mistakes. So if it's supervised, it can have great outcomes for the child in education. At the home, it's going to transform our homes. We already have Alexa, Siri answering our questions. They cut on our lights. They can control our heating systems. The George Jetsons of the past cartoon sitcom are going to become pretty self-evident in the next few years, as everything, whether it's a vacuum cleaner or a self-driving car or a self-flying aircraft, all of these things ultimately will likely become commonplace. And it's going to make our lives different than they are today, perhaps. I would say in good ways, but there are also the dangers, which we've talked about to a certain degree already.
One of the other things that's taking place that maybe many people are not aware of is that people are forming relationships, like almost quasi-sexual relationships with AI. I heard one woman being interviewed that was, quote unquote, marrying her AI partner. And so what does this mean for the future, not only for relationships between humans, but also for the future population, which we already have a problem with? I mean, it seems to me this could be perilous.
Certainly, we learned during the COVID-19 pandemic the issues of isolation and people becoming tethered to their machines. There's no doubt, Rob, that people have formed relationships. You indicated marriage, but there are many dramatic personal relationships, as I've indicated already, social operating system. They don't do anything. Some of these young people, especially teenagers that are left to their own devices, are doing things and asking about the machines and questions about social relationships. And so if you think it's funny that a bunch of teenagers will sit in the same room face to face, but they're on their iPhones texting one another who is 5 feet rather than talking to them face to face. Well, that's the reality. And AI is going to facilitate that, and it's going to exacerbate it in ways that is, in the past, for people of my age, we just never thought. Relationships of the future are going to be different than relationships of the past. Somehow, especially in families, we've got to set those iPhones down, set AI to the side, have face-to-face relationships so that we are created in the image of God. We need to recognize that AI should not substitute that relationship, much as our relationship with God.
Another concern I have in an area that you cover in the book, Bob, is in education. And I guess the overall question is AI making us smarter or dumber? And from what I've seen in my own kids who are doing some online college coursework, the vast majority of students are clearly and obviously using AI to answer their questions. So how is that making them smarter?
Yeah, it's not. And that's the real challenge for academics. Certainly in the book, I go through the teachers' unions, what teachers, professors are saying. We're returning to blue books and a lot of colleges where you leave your machine outside the classroom. I don't want to see iPhones in the classroom. And when you turn in a paper, just like MIT says, when I went through the course, if you used AI to write this, you need to tell me. Too often, the paper is written solely by AI. The answers are, if you had a take-home, it's answered by AI, and it's really draining us of the ability to do analysis and to do original work. The crux, and I think it's very dangerous. I don't like the idea that certain physicians are over-relying upon AI to answer questions. Yes, I do want them to read my CAT scan. I do want them to compare that with thousands, if not millions, of prior CAT scans that properly identified a cancer in my body. But at the same time, I want the human being doctor who has great experience to be involved in that diagnosis. I want it as a supplement, but not as the primary. And yet, that is becoming an issue. Education, I think education's being transformed. As I indicated, it can be a great tutor if it's guided properly. It can be a great instrument for helping you to improve your creativity, but it can become a crux in a way that is going to damage the intellectual capability of our future nation.
So in medicine, like pretty much every other discipline, it's going to require personal discipline to not be over-reliant on AI, and yet the human tendency is towards laziness, I think, for most people. So how do we exhibit self-control in this area, which is critically important?
That is the real challenge, Rob, to somehow figure out where I'm going to stop relying upon my AI assistant, which, is incredibly smart in terms of access to information about this diagnosis. I know Mayo Clinic, has done some phenomenal work, just like other clinics around the world, and they used AI to help predict outcomes for patients years in advance. They could look at their DNA, they could look at, the millions of other records, and they can be pretty reliably predictive of what might be the diseases you have in the future. I'm thinking back in September, and many people will have recalled this, when Vladimir Putin was walking with President Xi, and they were discussing, the Project 8 something or another there in Beijing that is trying to prolong life, and they're using AI, interestingly, through a variety of mechanisms to improve the quality as well as the longevity of human beings. And Xi turns to Putin and says, I think I might be able to live to 150 years old, if not longer. And that's the sort of promise of eternal life and salvation that is part of this whole conversation, something that certainly theologians must come to grips with. And as I read through the futurists, I understand, such as when I was listening the other day to Jan LeCun, who is a Nobel laureate and the godfather of deep learning, and today he, of course, is director of AI at Meta. He's talking about how we're trying to really go well beyond the generative agentic AI sort of environment today and to create a very different model for the future that is going to give us a very, I think, better appreciation and almost an autonomous AI that is going to address all aspects of our lives. So you've got the futurists there, but there are some clear dangers today that we have to come to grips with, and those dangers are over-reliance upon this stuff and the kind of shoving to the back our own humanity. My pastor, when I started this project a long time ago, he said, always keep the human in what you're doing. And I agree. That is the challenge today for parents, for individuals, for corporations, for the battlefield, and for medicine and education, and even for the retail. We are becoming an AI-centric world, and that is very, very dangerous, I would argue.
Well, it's certainly a threat to humanity very broadly and specifically. What words do you have, finally, Bob Maginnis, for AI regarding Christians and Christianity?
As I indicate, certainly in the book, I could easily interpret what's transpiring now as a tool for the end times. But for the interim, we need to untether ourselves from AI and our machines and be human as best as we can, but at the same time using the tool for God's glorification. It should not substitute for Bible reading. It should not substitute for fellowship, face-to-face fellowship, not internet fellowship. Parents need to be very concerned about what their children are using AI for. Children purposely, according to the Bible, need to have interface with other children. They need to grow up and appreciating their humanity and their relationship with God. And these are issues of grave consequence. So parents need to be proactive and not, in the background, allowing the AI to govern the rearing of their children. So that's a real challenge, Rob.
If people would like to get a copy of your book, AI for Mankind's Future, A Christian Perspective on the High-Tech Revolution, Bob, tell us how we can best do that.
Well, certainly Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, Target. It's all over the Internet. You can buy it from a variety of outlets. And I would encourage people to do that. It answers a lot of the questions about what is AI. But keep in mind, I'm going through the trilogy over the next 6 months of who controls AI, which is the next step, and then where does AI lead, which is really a very interesting theological effort, as well as understanding the technology and applying it today.
These are such important questions, and you've done a magnificent job in answering them. Robert L. Maginnis, thanks for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Certainly my pleasure, Rob. Have a great day.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at schillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time,